This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, I'm Kevin Rogers. I'm the Director of Reasonable Faith Adelaide, and tonight we have Joshua Meade, who's going to speak to us on the Human Genome Project. So at this point, I'll hand it over to Joshua. So away you go, Josh.
Thank you, Kevin. Good evening, everyone. Tonight I'm going to touch on the Human Genome Project and sort of what it means for human origins. This is sort of a more of just a hobby passion of mine. I'm a engineer by trade, bit of a different field of science, but yeah, anyway. And as we mentioned a bit earlier, if you've got any questions or comments, or if you have some extra information that I don't have covered on my slide, feel free to input anytime throughout the talk. That'd be great. Okay, so just a quick overview of what I've prepared today. I'm going to firstly cover some of the key positions about human origins. I'll be speaking on sort of behalf of the Christian perspective, but obviously if you're a Muslim or some other faith, you can basically just insert whatever said religion in instead. So I'll brief over those and just sort of say where we agree on different things and where we disagree on different things. And secondly, the second part of the discussion will be having a look at the Human Genome Project, some of the sort of the key findings, what we know about the human DNA, where that has a relevance to the origins debate, a couple of examples of where scientists expected to find things and they believe that they have. And then we'll just finish up with some of my concluding remarks and thoughts and maybe some of the discussion points that we can talk about. Okay, so starting with young Earth creationism. So I've basically got the same sort of section. Yes, I've got the same breakdown for each of the different viewpoints. So teleology basically means, is there a plan or purpose or a final goal for the universe? So young Earth creationists would say yes. They also believe that there's intelligent design, and that intelligent design points to a designer. Age of the universe, they believe it is young. Christian young Earth creationists believe that the Earth is about 6,000 years old. They do not believe in the macroevolution of life. They're willing to say that there's definitely a sort of a microevolution or adaptations that we can see in nature. But they would not say that there's a macroevolution of life. So God's activity in the origin of the universe and life, they would say yes, basically direct over 6 days where creation occurred. And God's activity in the lives of men and women, they would also say yes, God is active in the lives of men and women. He's a personal God. Their view on the Bible is that it's the word of God, and they take Genesis 1 to 3 as both spiritual correspondence and also that it has scientific concordism. So they believe that it can be held as a scientific book in a sense. And their interpretation of Genesis 1 to 3 is strict literalism, where creation days are 24-hour periods. Now, this is generalizations. Obviously, not everyone falls into every single category. But these, I'm just outlining the main lines of thought. So, human spirituality, they believe that humans are made in the image of God and that we can be sinful. And I've just sort of listed a couple of groups that fall within this category. So you've got CMI, Creation Ministries International, and Answers in Genesis, and a few other sort of researching groups. So I've laid out some strengths and weaknesses. These aren't necessarily my opinions on whether they're strengths and weaknesses, but this is just what sort of people against would say the weaknesses are, and for would say the strengths are. So it's consistent with the origins that the biblical writers had. The traditional view of the majority of Christians throughout history, and it's also consistent with the teachings and the sayings of both Jesus and the Apostle Paul. So within the New Testament, you can see there's plenty of references to, say, Adam and whatnot. So talking about the beginning and sin and whatnot. So yeah, I won't cover that too strictly there, but you can have a read of those passages anyway. Weaknesses. So there are some scientific issues. It does conflict with a lot of evolutionary sciences. So there's cosmological, geological, and biological. Some people would debate that, obviously. And another sort of statistic that I came across, which I can't verify, is I've got the link somewhere, but they were saying that 98% of American scientists accept that humans and other living things evolved over time. So that's an interesting statistic, and it's a challenging statistic. So we'd either have to say 98% of scientists have been fooled or misled, or they're simply wrong, and that's, I suppose, that requires a lot of evidence. So the second group is progressive creationism. So that's day age. Sorry, this is a little bit in my way. Here we go. So they've, without going through everything one by one, I'll go over them a bit more brief as we go, because they're all the same topics. So in the same way, they do believe that there's a plan and a purpose and a final goal for the universe, and that, there's also an intelligent designer. Where they differ from the young Earth creationists is they still believe that the Earth is old, 14 billion years old. They don't believe in the macroevolution of life, but in God's activity and the origin of the universe and life, they would say yes, but the interventions are over billions of years rather than over 6 days. And so that's where they differ mainly. Everything else is effectively the same here, except there's general literalism for the interpretation of Genesis 1-3. And groups that fall. Yep.
Excuse me, Josh, there's a bit of interference from some talking somewhere. Some interference.
Yeah.
There, Kevin. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll stop now. Yeah. All right. Yeah, just go on, Sarah. I don't know who it was.
You muted me, the cheek. All right. Very good. Yeah, so all right, so I think we had covered that. I can't remember exactly what I was up to. So, yeah, so groups that fall within this category are say reasons to believe, and I'm sure there's plenty of other ones, but I don't know all of them. Oh, here we go. So I've just jotted down some strengths and weaknesses for this sort of the day age theory. Strengths is that it's attractive to many Christians because it seems to align the Bible and our current scientific understanding in terms of the age of the universe. Just wonder, okay, I can hide that. Okay, cool. And it generally agrees with cosmological and geological evolution. In the same way, it's got basically the same weaknesses as the young Earth creationism. Now, I've actually put here a note under the 98% of American scientists. Now, the reason I put this is because I would be interested to know what proportion of people accept, say, evolution based on authority rather than experimentation. So I just thought that it would be maybe an interesting point.
Just a comment there, Joshua.
Yes.
Just a comment there. From what I understood from the talk, previously by reasons to believe, they do accept microevolution. So rather than rejecting biological evolution, it's only macroevolution that they.
Sorry, yeah. So I did say up here macro.
Yeah, and you had made that
macroevolution.
point, but this seemed to
Yeah,
contradict
okay.
it. But and their concept of microevolution is actually incredibly broad. So it goes up to the level of families, which is like really big stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway.
Yep. No. Okay. Good point. Thank you for that. Very good. Yeah, good input. Thank you. Yeah. So that's done anyway. So the third, well, the final sort of creationism. There's still, yeah. So the third worldview is evolutionary creationism. So that's so to break it down, so there's still a plan and purpose for the universe. There's still an intelligent designer. They believe the age of the universe is old, 14 billion years, but they do believe in the macroevolution of life. God's activity in the origin of the universe and life, yes, indirect self-assembly through ordained and sustained natural processes. So effectively, they believe that there's basically a guided evolution. They believe that God is a personal God who's actively involved in the lives of men and women. Sorry, my everyone's faces are covering half of my slideshow. Anyway, so the view of the Bible, and this is, I mean, this is evolutionary creationism is a very broad worldview. So I mean, there's obviously this is generalizing. So you just have to accept that. So a wide range of contrasting literary idioms. The Bible is a complex mixture and requires common sense to interpret correctly. So they believe that there is a spiritual correspondence, but not a scientific concordance. And so Genesis 1 to 3. So it's got spiritual truths, ancient science, ancient story, taking cosmology of the time and applying spiritual meaning to it, using it to speak spiritual truths. So they do believe that humans are sort of made in the image of God, and that there's still sinfulness. And groups that fall within this category are groups such as biologos. Strengths. So it accepts the Bible and seems consistent with all evolutionary sciences. Evolutionary creationism is absolutely consistent with scientific findings. That was a Gordon input there. So the weaknesses is it conflicts with 2,000 years of Christian tradition. Most Christians feel more comfortable with Genesis 1 to 3 having scientific concordism. And some Christians feel human evolution is a threat to the Bible and human dignity. Oopsies, I've gone backwards. Sorry. Oh no. That being said, many Christians feel entirely comfortable with human evolution. So, fourth worldview. So we're getting close to the end here. There's one more after this. So deistic evolution. So just to break it down a bit quicker, so not to let this drag on too much, they do believe that there's a plan or purpose or final goal. They do believe that there's an intelligent design. The age of the universe is old, 14 billion years old. The evolution of life, macroevolution of life, they would say yes. But God is more of an impersonal God here. So rather than having a personal relationship with his creation, he basically indirect self. So he created the world, the universe, and basically left his hands off after that. So they obviously they don't believe that the Bible is divine in any sense, and it should not be used as a book of science. I'll just cut over that a little bit. So the strengths of deistic evolution is that it seems to be consistent with all evolutionary sciences as well as other branches of science. And it's intellectually attractive to some people, like for instance, for the problem of evil and other things to do with it, having sort of a good God with evil in the world. Weaknesses. So it's very hard to consider how a personal and relational people could have been created by an impersonal and unrelatable God. And the view of God in this way fails to meet the spiritual needs of most people. Okay, and the last worldview is obviously atheistic evolution. So there's no plan or purpose or final goal. That's all an illusion. There's no design. That's also an illusion. Age of the universe is 14 billion years old. Life evolved, and obviously there's no God's activity in the origin of the universe and life, and in the lives of men and women there's no God. So that's all 5 of them basically summed up here. I've got it jumps a little bit here. So this is data taken from a US population over the years from 1983 through to 2019. That gives an indication of what people believe, what Christian population believe. So 44% in 1983 believe that God created man in the present form. 9% believe that man developed but God had no part, and 38% said that man developed but with God guiding. And more or less more or less the trend actually doesn't actually move as remarkably as what I might think. So as you can see there, everything becomes sort of closer together. So yeah, the trend of people believing that man developed but with God guiding dropped, but man developed but God had no part obviously came up to 22% there. So it does seem like the trend is that yeah, people will start believing more in the sort of the scientific explanation. I'm struggling with this. Okay, so just another survey that was taken was basically to do with church attendance and what how that defines so the likeliness of your viewpoint on origin. So this is also data that was collected in US populations, which is significant because a lot of the US is quite radicalized. So 67% of people that attend church weekly believe that basically in the young earth creationism, and that drops back to about 25% for people that attend church occasionally or seldom. And so yeah, so the trend is sort of shows quite strongly that people that are very strict with their Christianity are also quite strict with the literalism of the Bible. Okay, so there's a bit of a jump now. So I'm going to now talk about the Human Genome Project. So this is part 2 of the presentation. How are we going for time? Okay. Cool. So the overview of the Human Genome Project. It's a mapping and sequencing of all genes in the human genome. I'm going to have to hide this a little bit. Here we go. The Human Genome Project was started in 1990 and a complete genome was achieved in May of 2021. The project came in under budget It was expected to be about $3 billion, and it came in at 2.7. The cost to sequence DNA is now in the region of about $1,000 or even less if you want to get your own private genome. The human genome has approximately 3.1 billion base pairs. And the Human Genome Project has revealed that there are probably about 20,500 human genes, which is basically just a segment of DNA that codes for a protein. There's roughly 1% difference between us and chimpanzees at a DNA level. And a little point that Gordon wanted to add here. From a scientific perspective, the Human Genome Project has huge potential for sorting out genetic diseases, as well as enormous promise and prospective increases in crop yields for crop protection from disease, potentially saving us from possible regional or global famine, which will probably come in the view of climate change or whatever, however climate is changing. I put a link in here just to make the point that the Human Genome database is actually readily available, and all the tools that you need to run searches on genes and different sequences of DNA is actually all online, which is really cool. I've said here, this powerful tool lets us, the public, undergo DNA comparisons between animal species, such that we can verify and or validate claims that may be made without if there's claims that are made and we want to check those claims, we can actually select the genes and run the searches. So that's I find that quite cool that it's accessible to the public. The human genome similarities. So we're generally 99.9% similar to other humans. They believe that they found Neanderthal remains in 1997 in Germany, and although the DNA was quite damaged, they believe there's a 99.7% similarity there. There's also Denisovan remains, which are quite recently found, and they found 3,800 bone fragments in a Siberian cave, which also seem to have a 99.7% similarity. Chimpanzees have a 98.8% similarity to our genome, and then I've listed the rest of them there for your reading pleasure. Yeah, I just thought to give a perspective on how close the genomes are together. Okay, so so this is the DNA, basically a very simplified diagram of how the DNA works. So on the left hand side, we've got the cell, and you can see the little chromosomes inside the nucleus in the middle there. So they're little X shapes, and those X basically chromosomes can be seen in the right hand side figure there. So very simplified. Those chromosomes are wound up DNA, and those DNA effectively go on to produce sort of proteins and structural things within your body. Now, there is actually a little bit of extra DNA that we have, which is actually inside our mitochondria. So the vast majority of it's held within our the nucleus of our cells, but there's actually a little bit that's found within the mitochondria of our cells as well. So the mitochondria in the left-hand side of the oval, the yellow ovals with all the sort of the folds on the inside, and these mitochondria are responsible for producing all the energy that your cell requires. So you've got a lot of mitochondria inside the cells that, say, make up muscle tissue and whatnot. And the interesting, well, I suppose an interesting thing about the DNA found on the mitochondria is that it's spherical, so it's in a loop. yeah, so there's also a bunch of other parts of that cell that I know some things about. Yeah, but basically it's all, a lot of it goes towards supporting the manufacture of different proteins. So giving, so that what they call ribosomes a site to land on to perform these protein synthesis to basically build the cell. All right, it's a bit of a large image here, so it's a bit small, but I just wanted to show how the DNA is roughly packaged. Well, I wanted to show roughly how the DNA is packaged, should I say. So the DNA on the left-hand side, if it gets copied, then it needs to be unwound, and then it needs to wind itself back up effectively. And this is happening all the time. So there's molecules that are called histones, and they've got different binding sites. And so these histones, as you can see in the blue here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, they basically let the DNA wrap around them. And then those histones and those wrapped, the wrapped histones then configure to make these thicker strands, which then have a whole lot of scaffolding that actually forms this very complex structure that then basically holds it in the chromosome shape there. So that all those scaffolding proteins are all obviously made from the DNA itself as well.
Josh, what's a histone?
It's a molecule that's got different binding sites, and so it binds to the DNA. Yeah, so it looks like a scribble there, but it's it is really just a well, I don't have an image of it here, but it's just an well, I suppose it's an enzyme. Yeah, that just has active regions that can bind onto the double helix. Did that sort of answer your question? I did look into it at one point, and so I've got a rough idea of what they look like, but I don't have anything on me at the moment to show you.
Yeah, we'll continue.
Continue?
Can you
Yeah.
can you actually go back to that? Can you go back to that slide and just kind of explain that sequence, this diagram?
Well, I can sort of explain the sequence. I don't know much about the scaffolding proteins because it's quite hard to find information on them. I suppose it's not the sort of thing that you can take a video camera, to it and actually watch them come to life. I couldn't find any animations on it, but I'm sure there probably are somewhere. But effectively, these histones in the first sort of half of it.
See if you can use your mouse. You use your mouse to point to.
Oh, so you can actually see.
Yeah, we can see that. Yep.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if you could see my cursor or not.
Yeah.
Okay, so these are single histones here. So I'm not sure where you're unsure, but these histones all coil together to make a thick rope of them. And then well, your guess is as good as mine when it comes to these diagrams, but you can see where it's zooming up so that it's wrapped like a rope, and then so the scaffolding proteins will be the green here, and so it wraps around the green. I mean, it's a diagram to just basically show roughly how it works. It's a very rough diagram. It's not sort of scientific in any sense. It's just sort of shows the scale.
So basically you have a linear molecule and it's undergoing several orders of folding and bending,
wrapping. Yeah, that's
wrapping
the
to
idea.
make it thickness. So when you look at a chromosome, you kind of just don't imagine a thin molecule in there. It is this complex wrapping at different orders of magnitude.
And that's right. Yeah. So that's right. It's wrapping upon wrapping.
And the other really important thing is these histones that are involved with the transcription. Most of the genes are not actually transcribed into amino acids and proteins. There is this enormous amount of redundant DNA in the genome that doesn't get transcribed. There's debate about what function it is, but that's nothing to remember.
Sure.
Yeah.
So are you referring to the sort of the junk DNA, or you mean like the introns and whatnot?
Or both. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's. I was sort of trying to find sort of figures on sort of junk DNA and what different ideas are, but it seems to be vastly different opinions on the matter, and no one really knows, from what I understand, which is understandable because you were always discovering new things that different sequences do stuff that maybe we didn't know that they did in the past. So.
But there are little parts of the gene that tell it to start transcribing and to stop transcribing. So there are bits of the actual sequence which are known and recognized as the start of a gene and the end of a gene, and then there's stuff that doesn't sort of have that. Yep.
Yeah, for sure. I think they call them start codons and stop codons, don't they? Okay, so so kind of following on from that, which just a little bit of background information on the the introns and exons that we're just talking about, because it is mentioned later on in the slide. So if you've got some DNA that produces an RNA strand, which is basically a direct copy of that DNA strand, only what they call the exon regions actually become the final protein, and these intron regions are actually spliced out. They're taken out, and those introns basically say how to configure the exons, so it's not all necessarily linearly spliced out. They might have some repeats, for instance. So I'll just quickly read what I've written here. So exons are the part of the DNA that finally gets coded into the protein. Introns are spliced out. So why do we do this? So introns can regulate the exon sequence in many different ways, leading to significant data efficiency within the DNA. That is, one gene can produce many proteins. Scientists estimate that 70% of our genes code for at least 4 proteins each. So just some other notes. There is a specific human gene that can be used to make 576 different proteins, thanks to the way that the introns and exons are arranged. And then I found another, I think it's probably the highest that I've found so far, but in fruit fly, there's a specific gene that can be used to make 38,016 different proteins. So that's fairly impressive. I'd say it's got a high intron to exon ratio. Yeah, and just another side note there's an average of 8.8 exons and 7.8 introns per human gene. So just to give a ballpark there. So the human genome, the chromosome. So I'm sort of going to start discussing human ancestry and why they believe that there is a link between us and earlier primates, and sort of the argument for and against. So the missing chromosome. So the chromosome set on the left is the human chromosome set, which there is 23 pairs, so 46 in total. And then on the right hand side, there's the chimpanzee genome, which has got 24 pairs, so 48 in total. Now they were expecting, I suppose, to find that we would have the same number of chromosomes, but they noticed that 2A and 2B in the chimpanzee chromosome were a lot shorter than our human 2 chromosome. So, so based on what they could deduce, they worked backwards and hypothesized that the human chromosome must have at some stage fused together. So an interesting test that they did was they've taken, so the little arrows that you can see on here that are genes. So genes that are sort of common amongst humans and chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans. So they've lined their chromosome 2A and 2B up, and so the genes basically match to the same place. And the other interesting things that they did find was that on the human chromosome 2, there does appear to be evidence of a fusion site where they expect to see a fusion, and they claim that there's also a fossil centromere as well. So the centromere being sort of the middle part of the X when the chromosome's dividing. So these chromosomes here are not dividing, so they just look like straight, they're just linear. But the centromere is this part here. Sorry. Yeah, so I think now the other part is that at the end of chromosomes, there's what they call telomeres, and that's a repeated sequence. Now, as the cell is getting older and older, these repeated sequences get sort of damaged and reduced. So you can tell, generally speaking, how old a cell is, or by how reduced these telomeres are. Now I've gone. Yeah. So I'll just jump back to the slide. So many scientists believe this is strong evidence to suggest that there was a fusion event in our recent history from a recent ancestor, especially finding these fusion sites and cryptic centromeres. Institute for Creation Research had some arguments against this chromosome 2 fusion. So they say one argument against the fusion of 2A and 2B is that the small size of the fusion site, which is only roughly 800 DNA letters long. Telomere sequences at the end of chromosomes are usually 5,000 to 15,000 bases long. If 2 chromosomes had fused, you should see a sort of a fused telomere signature of sort of 10,000 to 30,000 bases long, not roughly 800. So although I'm sure there's something to this argument, the claim is weakened by the fact that telomere regions do shorten over the duration of the cell's life. So it's not necessarily solid sort of rebuttal there, but there is something in it potentially. So they also say that multiple telomere sequences are common all over the genome. So therefore, it is unsurprising that we find some telomere sequences nearby where they were looking. Telomeres are a 6-base sequence of the DNA letters T, T, A, G, 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 repeated over and over again at the ends of chromosomes. When the fusion sequence is compared to that of a pristine fusion signature, of the same size, it's only 70% identical overall, given the standard theoretical model of human evolution. It should be about 98 to 99% identical, not 70%. So that's their argument that they've put across. So yeah. So also they discuss the fossil centromere. They say the fusion site also contains an important sequence of DNA called a transcription factor binding site. This is a sequence of which a molecule can attach so as to regulate how often the gene is used. So the fusion site is right in the middle of an intron of a functional gene, which serves as an important engineered process. Additionally, the size of the fossil centromere is measured at roughly 33,000 base pairs in length, which is significantly shorter than the healthy centromeres that typically span 250,000 to 5 million base pairs. So they're saying the fossil centromere is significantly smaller, and it is sort of right where an actual gene is expressed. So it seems to be a part of a gene in a sense. So so with so that's basically their view on that. What I have said following that, this is yes, I've said that being said, the sequences found in this region do bear a remarkable resemblance to the kinds of sequences found when a chromosome fusion event has occurred. So so that was chromosome 2. So there's also another.
Just before you leave that,
yeah,
Joshua,
sure.
I think one of the important things that sort of hasn't come out of that at all is the mapping of the similarity between the gene sequences on the chimp chromosome 2A with the first part of the human chromosome 2 and the chimp chromosome 2B with the second part. So
sure.
Sorry, there may be some technical problems with explaining the actual joins and everything else, but you're still left with the chimp's got 2 chromosomes, which actually map up against the single chromosome of humans. So how else? The whole thing begs an explanation that either something divided or something fused to account for that similarity, because it's quite bizarre otherwise, isn't it, really? And we don't want to lose sight of that in what you're presenting.
Sure. Yeah, no, and you're very right. I mean, I suppose I didn't give enough maybe discussion on this slide here, where I was to say, you know, if you were to take more than just the 4 genes, they do line up, and that's what I was trying to show here. With the two,
all of that does assume evolution. That does not provide evidence one way or another. It's just assuming evolution and working on that basis.
Yeah. Well, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to sort of provide evidences from both sides, and at the end of the day, so to people to draw their own conclusion, and so I'm not trying to push one way or the other. I'm just trying to suggest what evidences are given for different views on a topic here. But yeah, sorry, I was intending on saying that it is an interesting thing that the genes from 2A and 2B do line up so well to the human gene 2, chromosome 2, should I say. Thank you for pointing that out. So I'll sort of brief over this one, because I didn't get a chance to look into this a huge amount, but it is of interest as well. So the Nanog gene is basically the gene that's responsible for the proliferation, renewal, and the ability for a cell to what did I write here? Develop into the 3 primary germ cells, or germ cell layers of the early embryo. So it's named after basically new life. So these cells can go and sort of be used in different areas of the body. So the gene itself is actually found on chromosome 12. but there's what they believe is that it was reverse transcribed back into the DNA by mistake in other parts of our human genome as well, on various different chromosomes. And what they've found is that those same Nanog genes that are dysfunctional, the broken copies of them, have been found in the chimpanzee chromosome as well. So it basically begs the question as to why are these sort of broken genes or dysfunctional genes found in both the human and the chimpanzee chromosomes. Now, I haven't gone down that rabbit hole a huge amount yet, but I just wanted to put it in as a information slide to say this is another point of discussion amongst sort of evolutionary science and maybe young, sort of creationism. So that's basically going to wrap that up. I put a few questions here that I might sort of want to have in our discussion, mainly because I feel like it seems like it's quite a tapu topic at times. People get quite well, here I'll read out some of the questions that I put here. So if biblical inerrancy is held very dear to many Christians from personal experience. So I mean, I know a lot of Christians, and I'm very close to a lot of people that would say I'm being a naughty boy if I believe maybe that parts of the Bible are not to be taken literally, or whatnot. Is that helpful or is that harmful? Are we so is it the right approach there? Other questions. The difference in Christian perspectives often brings out an emotional response. Should Christians be emotionally attached to their particular origin worldview? It's like people sort of I find often these topics can get quite heated very quickly, and I'm not really too sure why. But it seems to be there's a sort of a knee-jerk reaction when people bring up this topic in particular. Does the topic of discussion have an overbearing level of a sort of a confirmation bias tied from all sides, or so like reading some of the papers, some of the comments that you read on them, or some of the reviews, it sort of says, oh, this is the final nail in the coffin for evolution, or this is the final nail in the coffin for some other worldview. And I'm not sure if that's a helpful mindset to have per se. Anyway, so I mean, you can obviously read those questions, and I'm sure that you guys have got plenty of questions yourself, but they were the questions that I had for you guys anyway. So thank you for listening and putting up with my raspy voice. Well, if everyone's happy, we can move into the discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much for doing your presentation, Josh. And we'll just there's not a lot of comments in the chat, so I think I'll just open it up for general questions and discussion. And I'll go to gallery view. So if you feel free to unmute when you would like to make a contribution.
Okay.
Hey, Josh.
Thank you for that. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go.
Yeah, look, thank you for the overview. And your first question is something that I find very difficult with when I look at the whole evolutionary argument for the evolution of humans from other primates. Is at what point?
Which
did we
question?
become,
Sorry.
At what point did we actually become human and have a relationship with God and
Oh,
become
yes.
a spiritual being? If we have this gradual evolution
Mhm.
from the apes, and for me, that's probably the most difficult area that I don't really know the answer to. But
Yeah.
in thinking about that question, at what point did the human spirit and relationship with God, especially the whole human nature, come into being, which was a gradual process? It's really hard to see, but I also draw a parallel between at what point do we become human? I mean, we start out as an egg and a sperm cell, and those eggs and sperm cells we just treat as just cells, like, you know, the cells that die in our fingernails and anything else, they're irrelevant. And they come together and make a zygote, a single cell. It has the potential for a human, but it's not human. It's just a single cell. I mean, you know, we're in awe of all of this. That's all. We all came from a single cell, where, you know, our maternal chromosomes and paternal chromosomes were shared, half from each, and that's our potential, our genetic potential. But then, you know, it becomes a 4-celled thing. It becomes a 16-celled thing, and it keeps on dividing and starts to specialize. And at some point in there, I'd actually be concerned about the, you know, it's not just a bunch of cells, it's actually becoming a human, but it's a gradual process, and that's a total mystery. And so I have a very similar response to, well, how does God make a human who's fundamentally different from all the animals out of a gradual process from hominids? But I'm just as much stuck with how we become a human out of a single cell and just a few bunches of chromosomes. It's incredible.
I think some people
yeah.
would disagree with part of your thesis there, that a sperm and an egg are not human. I would agree with that. They're just cells, as you kind of put it. But once they combine, the entire DNA of the person it will be is there. And you start with zygote, fetus, baby, toddler, child, adolescent, adult, which is the one that's more human. I would suggest they're all human, just at different stages of development.
Well, you don't see all the human, the potential human, yeah, they're potentially human, but you don't see any spiritual capacity in a single cell.
Do you see spiritual capacity in a newborn baby?
Yes, I think you do.
And the difference
And
is that you
somewhere in
can see the
between-
baby, is it?
Hey?
And the difference is that you can actually see the baby, is it?
No, but the baby does have an awareness, which I don't believe a single cell has. It doesn't have a nervous system, a single cell.
I'd say a fetus has an awareness, though.
Yeah, well, that's a lot more advanced than a single cell or 4 cells
Yeah.
or 16 cells
Yeah.
or a few hundred cells.
But
An adult has more than a child.
That's right. That's exactly my point. There's a continuum there.
but the
It's
baby,
very hard to understand.
the baby comes to life with the breath of life on birth when they're born.
So it's not alive before it's born.
Not really, not a live, viable human until it can actually function independently from the mother, independently, breathing.
So how old do you have to be before we can actually function independently? All babies I have seen are totally dependent.
You're being pedantic.
No, I'm not actually. It's an important question, really.
Outside the womb, breathing their lungs are breathing. And so, you know, the prem baby goes into a machine. Yes, they're human. They're being, you know, of course they're human, but they're being helped to breathe. But inside the womb,
Well, inside the womb, they're getting the oxygen through the placenta. So in one sense, they're breathing underwater. They're still exchanging oxygen molecules for their respiration. They're still breathing. In that sense, they're just not taking air into their lungs. But, you know, like, is that what's important? Or, you know, they're aware of things. They have, you know, they can perceive, they can feel. They're studies, incredible
They
things.
respond to music.
A baby in the world. Yeah, yeah. So, like, there's a continuum. I agree with Brian. There's nothing. There's a major change when birth happens, but it's not everything. There's a whole lot of continua there as well.
Yeah, Rosalind came out 5 weeks premature. Yeah, to say that she was more human.
Because she was born, and if she hadn't been born at that point.
It would seem a bit interesting, strange, I suppose. Yeah. Anyway, probably that's probably for more of an abortion topic, isn't it?
It is, but yeah, but it is a fundamental problem that I have with the evolutionary model, is kind of accepting that at some point something special happened, unless, the only thing that I could conceive of as being special, you could have the gradual thing of increased intelligence and emotional intelligence and all this kind of stuff through primate evolution, to a point where the only key thing that I could think of that would make a big difference, where God actually chooses to reveal himself to a hominoid biped. And once that revelation's happened, it opens up a whole new spiritual dimension. So that, to me, is the only way that I would actually get out of this problem, which, I'm not totally convinced this solves all the answers, but that's the way in the past that I've tried to understand it.
It still leaves the question of why there is such a big gap between us and anything else in existence right now.
In terms of a big gap, isn't like there's nothing.
Not genetically, there isn't, but in terms of, like the human characteristics, yes, I agree.
We seem quite distinct, don't we?
Language and
distinctly
all of those
different.
things. Yeah.
How much information is on one gene? Because when we say, like, when we share 98% of, or is that what it is, not of the genes with how much information is on a gene?
So a gene, a gene basically, so the similarity is based on genes rather than, I believe, rather than junk DNA. So our genes are 98%, 99% basically similar to chimpanzees. How much information is found on a gene? Well, like I said here, genes are effectively, they go to produce proteins and stuff basically to build your cells. Proteins can be structural, they can be enzymes, which help in the in processing chemical reactions and whatnot.
So is it thousands of pieces of information then on each gene?
So here I've said there's an average of so a protein is made up of amino acids, and each amino acid is basically 3 of these rungs. So you'd have to look at the length of an amino acid, the length of a protein in amino acids. So it's basically the amino acids twist and contort and make some kind of a structural protein. So here the green, the red and the blue proteins, they're basically a contorted structure which is made up of amino acids. So every single one of these blocks in this chain come from basically 3 rungs of the ladder and what that codes for. And the way that these combine will produce different shapes. They've got different active points which can produce chemical reactions and whatnot.
Yeah, but so you can say it's thousands of pieces of information on one gene.
Yes,
yeah.
definitely.
So I think from a layman's point of view, I think it's quite deceptive. It's just it's not clear, because to say where we share 98% with the chimp, it's not. There's too much of a gap in between. There's too much information on each gene to actually sort of definitively say that's what it is. Even though I know that's what it is, if you get what I'm saying.
No.
It's just so much information on there. Like, we share 35% of the same genes as a daffodil. right?
Yeah.
60% with the banana.
35% the same. So it's, to me, this whole gene stuff is, it's elusive, and it's really, because it's so from a scale, from a molecular scale, is so huge, right? Nothing else compares to it. It's a bit deceptive. The figures are too deceptive, you know.
I work in IT,
Cromwell, can
and
I-
one of the things that is concentrated on over and over and over in my industry is getting more and more information onto smaller and smaller things. And we can now get terabytes of information on the SD card that goes into a camera, which I find amazing. Nevertheless, DNA is meant by many orders of magnitude the most information dense medium we have, and it is kind of what information scientists are working on to aim for storage, to be able to store more and more data.
Can I just comment on that? There is a bit of misunderstanding here. I don't think the actual sequencing wasn't working out the sequence of genes. It was actually working out the sequence of base pairs within the whole of the human genome, and it's been done for gorillas and orangutans now as well. And so it's actually I just Googled how many base pairs in a gene, and it says the answer that came up says human genes are commonly around 27,000 base pairs. And we're looking at millions of base pairs that were sequenced as part of the Human Genome Project. And the comparisons between human DNA and chimpanzees' DNA, which comes at 98.6%, is based on the matching up of base pairs. So that's all that structure from within the gene is taken into account. So say on average, say 27,000 base pairs make one gene, it's matching all of those up and saying, well, there's between chimpanzees, they're actually 98.6% the same.
And I know, but there's still a lot of information that you can fit on one gene. And
it's
so I just say it's incomprehensible, really. It's very hard, especially when you're not a scientist, or whether you deal with this type of stuff, to actually get it into your head and try and get your head around it. It sounds like we pretty much are one step away from being them, but in fact, the bridge is long. You know?
Well, the differences are really important, but the point that it does underlie is the whole thesis that either God created us on the same pattern and then made variations to create these differences, or as the evolutionists would put it, we have this common origin. So with the basic building blocks, we all all life respires. So we all have the same, need for mitochondria if we're a complex multicellular organism. We all have the same sort of basic pathways.
We're all based on carbon.
So it's not a surprise from an evolutionary point of view that there is so much similarity with a tree. There's 50% there. But the degree of similarity with the greatest with the things that based on particular mutations and evolutionary understanding, the degree of similarity is generally the greatest with the most closely related things from an evolutionary point of view. And that's all you can say. So the fact that we're 98.6% similar to chimpanzees doesn't prove that we evolved from chimpanzees, but it is certainly consistent with being built out of the same building blocks, and then a process of evolution by variation, or God using the same materials to design us and build us.
And the same patterns too.
Yeah.
Similar patterns. Because why? Because they work, The
problem, the main problem I have that I see, the strongest argument against that is when you find mistakes repeated in a highly structural way, which sort of begs the question, why would God create mistakes, or, and you can say they're not mistakes, but why do they fit this particular pattern? And
you can release some of that down to entropy.
Well, entropy will produce random patterns. It won't produce ordered patterns. That's the whole problem. So if you look at the loss of vitamin C, for example, vitamin C is missing in all the primates, so gorillas, chimpanzees, humans. We lost that ability. Most mammals can have the full gene which produces vitamin C, but when you look at that section of DNA in the human genome, you find there's a mutation that basically stops that production, and that same mutation is present in the larger primates. But if you go to the primate family tree and look at the very primitive ones that got stranded on Madagascar, which has got a huge variety of lemurs, you'll find that the lemurs actually do have the ability, like most other mammals, to produce vitamin C. But then you look in the, that mammal human family tree, and you find that, we also noticed that fruit bats can't produce vitamin C. And another example, amongst the rodents, so you have this whole big tree of rodents, and then the guinea pig can't. And you say, well, maybe God didn't want them to have. So did he use the same kind of mistake to stop vitamin C being produced in the bats and the guinea pigs as what he did in the higher primates? You actually look at it, you find it's a completely different mutation, which is what evolution would predict, because it's hardly likely that just by chance the same thing's going to happen independently. Whereas if evolution's true, it only happened once in the higher apes, and that's got inherited by chimpanzees, gorillas, humans, orangutans. We all didn't have the ability to produce vitamin C. It could have been handy, but because that mistake happened and we were able to survive without it, it's that same mutation. But it's a completely different mutation in the fruit bats and in the guinea pigs. Now, that's really hard to explain as God's intention. And so it's those kind of patterns repeated over and over and over that kind of lead me to kind of see that, well, evolution makes a lot more sense. But at least there's an explanation for it, which I haven't heard alternatives that kind of gel in the same way.
Just like to say, Peter, I really like the way you talk about things being consistent or making sense, not being dogmatic or getting stuck into anything like that. You're just explaining how it makes sense to you, which is, I think, very worthwhile.
Thanks, Brian.
This business of common descent would seem to be problem for progressive creationism, because progressive creationists kind of don't believe in macroevolution. They believe that God intervened at various points. But if there is strong evidence for common descent from an ancestor for both chimpanzees and human beings, then that would seem to go against the progressive creationist view. Does that make sense, Peter?
Yeah, it does, except I remember in Hugh Ross's talk that humans were singled out as a special case of evolution. So they kind of like grouped humans as sort of in a class of their own based on the unique things that we have. And there is a huge discontinuity, I believe, between humans and animals. But yeah.
Hugh Ross's position did seem a lot like a theistic version of punctuated equilibrium.
Well, except God was doing the rapid genetic changes, which I guess one of the issues with that point that I find interesting is that Hugh is very willing to bring in the miraculous when it comes to biological and evolutionary problems, but when it comes to the physics, it always has to be a completely natural explanation. So I see some inconsistency there.
Yeah,
that's simple. That's simple science. That's more simple in a sense, less complex.
Agree.
Yeah. So, change from a cosmology point of view is a lot more simple. Earlier on, Josh, slightly different topic, but you made the point that most Christians would prefer or would find it easier to believe that in a biblical viewpoint to some point, to some degree. I wonder now at the moment, because I think you'd find a lot of people in Catholicism or in the mainline churches like Uniting Church or Church of England would definitely hold more to an evolutionary model. And I wonder, I actually think it's different. The statistics aren't quite clear on it, but I think that it's turning, you know, like people are agreeing more likely in an evolutionary model.
I thought Josh's display of the people who go to church on a regular basis to the people who only go occasionally, and how that translates into their beliefs relates very much to that particular point there, Bronwyn.
True, but in a lot of those mainline churches, that actually doesn't follow either. They are much more of what Gordon would be saying, agreeing with the spiritual points that Genesis makes, or even the Old Testament, and wouldn't be believing in the miracles. Yeah. And I've got family members who are heavily involved in Uniting Church, for example, and the leaders in it, and that's what they hold. That's the viewpoint they hold. So, yeah, I don't know. And I'd say Church of England would be the same. And a lot of people do go; they go regularly.
Yeah.
So
it was just sort of a poll that was done that I thought was interesting. So I thought I'd chuck it in there.
Yeah. Australia might be different to America too, or England.
Yeah. And that was a point that Gordon made when I was going over my slides with him. He said America's, and I sort of did mention the US is often very radicalized, like they're very extreme in one sort of viewpoint or the other.
Yeah.
And so I think when I first came along to Reasonable Faith, I think, Kevin, you said it's only been maybe the last 100 years or maybe a couple of 100 years that inerrancy in the Bible has actually really been a thing. I think that was you that said that.
I may have, but I know this is a point that's pushed heavily by Mark Worthing from Table College, who was formerly from Table College. But I think a lot of those statistics reflect who, with various groups, who is their target audience. If you look at the young Earth creationists, they mainly appeal to evangelical churches, whereas the other groups are probably more targeting the scientific community.
Yeah.
And so that's probably partly an explanation of why people from evangelical churches are often listening to the CMI groups, the young Earth creationists. Whereas,
do you consider your church to be evangelical, Kevin?
Yeah, Baptist.
Would you consider yourself to be scientific?
Yes, I'm both. But I'm probably a bit unusual. But I know within our Baptist churches, you do get people who follow the young Earth creationists, and people who are quite ignorant of science say, "I know what I believe." But basically they hear one side of the debate because they hear the Yeks actually target evangelical churches, whereas the other groups tend not to.
My comment on that is because I've been in churches that are all different positions in my Christian walk. What I find fairly quickly, people own a worldview very early on in their education, and one of the problems you get is very hard to get good, honest debate on some of these topics.
Yes.
And for example, I'm a young Earth creationist, but I don't get invited in particular situations at all. And I'm told directly to my face, it would become divisive if you came and gave your point of view, which to me is quite opposite to a lot of other topics we debate in different denominations, whether you're talking this issue or that. The onus generally is look at the different perspectives and let people make their own point of view. But I've found as soon as you raise the young Earth model and the science for it, by the way, not just the theology, but the science that supports it, you get reactions. And it's quite intimidating when you're told that that becomes divisive. I grew up where you were encouraged to ask questions, and I went to uni and we were asked to question things. But that's become a bit of an issue for me over the years. Just on this point, I just want to, for Peter Lang, the Creation Ministry group promotes a book called Genetic Entropy, written by a guy who's a researcher in genetics, Cornell University, and he gives a lot of scientific argument for explaining the genetic entropy as the reason for the mistakes. And in the book, he goes into the reaction he's had in the academic community he relates to, how a lot of them don't even want to talk to him about it. And yet he's raising very valid scientific argument on the topic. So that's what you're up against in a lot of this too, that people have a set view and don't want to debate or discuss.
Yeah, I'm not sure why, but it does seem to become, like you say, quite there seems to be an intolerance of having an opposing view in this topic, and it sort of baffles me why. And I suppose that sort of leads on to the question here: does the topic of discussion have an overbearing level of confirmation bias?
Yeah, trying to avoid the issues, sweeping it under the carpet. But you can understand a kind of a minister's point of view. He's trying to hold the team together, if you
Well,
have.
But why does it have to be an argument? Like, I mean, I've tried to present both sides as sort of fairly, and I mean, you know, I'm sure there's information that I've missed out because I just had, you know, I've got limited time to sort of research the topic, but
and there was a time to talk.
yes, yeah, and yeah, so, but nobody's worldview offends me. Everything's up for debate, you know, everything's to within reason. I mean, everyone has a sort of a reason for what they believe or the conclusions I've come to.
Yeah, well, I agree. You should be able to discuss it in a rational way and not make enemies. I can tell you what the Christian position is on this. Be slow to speak, quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to get angry, consider others better than yourselves. Love is gentle, patient and kind, and bears other differences. That's a Christian position.
It reminds me of the debate they had in the New Testament about circumcision, where the Jewish Christians got heated about whether the new Christians should be circumcised. Remember that? So that became a really huge, massive, divisive point. And I wonder whether they actually came to a complete conclusion about it. I think they probably still had people in different camps.
To a certain extent they did, but I think the whole point that they were arguing about there was, is this essential for salvation? And if it is essential for salvation, then we need to make sure that we stick to it. Or the other side, if it's not essential for salvation, then it's important that we let it go. And so until they could work out the answer to that question, it was very important on both sides.
And Paul got very pointed on it and very critical of his opposition at that point, didn't he?
Well, this is a similar thing for me. This isn't essential to salvation, right? You can hold a different opinion. Really, ultimately, one day we'll all find out the truth.
Well, yeah, I don't think God would get too worked up on trying to figure out how he did things. And if there's thing, you know, I think, yeah.
Again, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Truth is of fundamental importance to God. But at the same time, none of us has all the truth. And if God is going to make that the criteria for salvation, then we're all lost.
Yes.
I think I like Peter's point where it's about how different humans are to animals. You know, there is more than just the way we're made. Our exceptionalism is a massive point that people forget.
Yeah, that 1% difference makes a lot of difference.
Yeah, significant.
Yes, obviously. Too.
Can I ask Joshua a question on the debate about the Neanderthals and the Denisovans? I gave a talk a while back on the post-flood world, and you can give a strong argument for civilization taking off relatively recent. But when the debate comes in about the so-called hominids, it complicates the debate. And my position is that they're fully human, but there is a genetic entropy factor that's changing certain characteristics. Could you comment a bit about the issue there of what actually is the difference between a Neanderthal and what we would call a modern human, given that we've got proof that their DNA is within our biology?
So they were saying it was 99.7%. I haven't gone into all the sort of the fossil changes per se, like the differences in the fossil. I was looking at all the bone structures during my preparation to this, but I haven't actually. I wouldn't be able to tell you. It does appear that they've got a slightly larger brain. I think it's slightly larger.
Yeah, larger brain, definitely.
Larger brain, and the jaw's quite a bit different too. But yeah, for me, the idea that they could be human, if you know, following along the lines of young Earth creationism, I'd be more comfortable that they were obviously human than say some other sort of form of great ape or something, if that's what you're asking.
An interesting question, which I think no one would be prepared to really ask or examine at the moment, is just to compare the DNA of the various races of people on Earth. Now, I'm not suggesting that any race is more or less human than any other, but there are clear differences, just skin color for one example, or hair color another one. Be interesting to know what differences there are between the various races on Earth at the moment.
Yeah, well,
It has been studied. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of universities do that with the mitochondrial DNA because it's so accessible. You just basically take it through some temperature cycles, and you can get your own little kits, and you just get cheek cells, and so you can see how close, say, if you've got an African person in your class and a Chinese person in your class, you'll find that they have significantly more diversity in their DNA than what, you know, all the Europeans do, for instance. So there is a noticeable difference, for sure. Yeah.
Just what percentage is wondering compared to, say, talking about Neanderthals and modern humans, supposedly, how that would relate as well.
Yeah.
Given that I would tend to agree with Trevor that they are all human as well.
Yeah,
there's an interesting book.
I'm not sure on that.
Josh, there's an interesting book put out by Brian Sykes, who's a professor of genetics at Oxford, I believe, called The Seven Daughters of Eve.
Yes.
Have you come across that?
I haven't, no.
In that book, he explains that he started off looking at hamsters in Britain, and he was able to show that every one of them was related to a hamster found in Syria from some very ancient site. And that got him thinking about if all the hamsters in Britain are related. He achieved that by getting samples from members of the Hamster Society, which is quite large in Britain, would you believe? And he then asked the question, is it true of humans? And he was able to show that most of the modern Europeans in Europe, traditional Europeans, have common ancestry going back to what is so-called mitochondrial Eve. And in his book, he goes into the science which shows the commonality origin argument. They're showing it gets down to 7 clan mothers can explain most of the mothers in Europe.
Yeah, so they've found 7 pools of mitochondrial DNA that all seem to have some sort of similarity that can be tracked back to, well, they can track it back to 7 pools, you're saying, at the moment.
The relevant thing about mitochondrial DNA is it's only inherited via the mother most
Yes,
of the
actually,
time.
I forgot to mention
That's
that.
not completely true. There are exceptions to that apparently, but
Really?
the result of that is that it's easier for lines to kind of die out. And so there's a big misunderstanding about mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam, in that they're seen to be, you know, like an origin, but really they're basically just how far a lineage you can go back with a lineage before that, you know, back to the origin of a particular lineage, a particular mutation, combination of genes, and how old that's likely to be. It doesn't mean that was the beginning by any means. So it's quite often, it's a very unfortunate use of terminology, but I've seen so often in the literature, it gets completely misunderstood. It's just the beginning of a traceable lineage, and lineages don't go back forever, you know, especially with mitochondria, where there's only one parent, they can die out a lot more easily.
But the Y chromosome is carried by the male, isn't it?
And it's only carried by the male. Yep.
So, yeah. Kevin, I forgot to mention, so I was meant to mention that with the mitochondrial DNA, is that because it's not actually within the nucleus, when it is passed on, it's within the egg, so it's within the egg cell, but it doesn't actually get passed through the sperm. So it only stays in the mother line. It only gets passed down through to females. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yep.
Is that consistent with what Peter was saying?
Yes.
Yes. So, here. So the mitochondria are inside the cell, but they're not actually inside the nucleus. And inside the nucleus is where the chromosomes split, or sort of divide. And so the mitochondrial DNA inside these oval rugby ball looking things, they just get carried on through the female. Although he did say that there was a strange anomaly where it can actually get passed through the male. I'm not sure how that works, but
so you don't get this mixing of DNA happening. You just get this sort of passing down. So you get these long chains of lineage with the mitochondria and with the Y chromosomes.
Mm. Are you unsure of something, Kevin? You look unsure.
I'm unsure of lots of things.
No. The DNA, the very small fraction of DNA that's found in these other organelles in the cell, they can't get carried on a sperm. So they're just carried through the female.
Yeah, I'm aware of that. They're not real good on the mechanics.
It's rather small mechanics.
Oh, it's the bird and the bees, Kevin.
Right, okay. You can explain it to me one day.
Yeah, right.
Joshua, I'm trying to get my head around, going back to what Bron was saying, what sort of information is in that nucleus that you say gets passed through the sperm? That's how it's that genome.
And the egg as well. So these chromosomes here, each of these sort of lines on the human chromosome is sort of a gene, or details a gene, and these genes basically dictate. Well, it's very mechanical, really. They go through a process called protein synthesis, and probably they do all sorts of other stuff too, but protein synthesis is the process by which they it takes the DNA as like a building a set of instructions, and three by three along the rungs. Where did I have the photo? Sorry, just so here. So three of these rungs codes for one amino acid, and amino acids are basically the building blocks of proteins. And proteins can do all sorts of functions in the cell, like structural. They all your enzymes are proteins, and all that. So I'm sure it goes deeper than that. That's probably very generalized, but that's the general overview. So those chromosomes here are actually only found to be looking like an X in that appearance when they're actually dividing into two. So when they divide into two, that's basically they are producing cell division, and so one cell becomes two cells, and that's how cells can reproduce themselves. So basically along the entire strand of DNA, these chromosomes will split, so it goes from looking like an I, a straight line, into an X, and then from that X it gets pulled apart, boom, and then it's two strands of DNA all of a sudden. If that makes sense.
Everyone's DNA is unique, right?
Yes. Yeah.
The DNA we have from our parents, we have one set from our mother and one set from our father. So they're sort of like matching chromosomes, but they've got different genes on them. And of course, our parents got one from each of our grandparents, a set from each of our grandparents, but we don't actually have equal a quarter from each grandparent, because the chromosomes are, because there's a double, there's two lots of each, and there's no guarantee that when I'm getting my father's chromosomes through my grandparents' chromosomes through the sperm, that I could get all my grandfathers, I could get all my grandmothers, because there's two sets, and only they kind of line up at random. And so it depends how they line up. And they can also kind of transfer, they cross over, and they actually swap bits of each other, the chromosomes. So there's actually a bit of mixing up going on. So even though you've got exactly all the DNA I have either came from my mother or my father, and that DNA that I do have matches my mother and father exactly, and I have 50% from each, but as far as grandparents are concerned, I don't have 25%. It's not equal. It's mixed up at that level. But the other thing is, so while the chromosome I got from my mother and the one I got from my father, the same chromosome, I've got both of those, and I'm identical with my parents in that regard, but I'm not identical to my brothers or my sisters. But the other thing is that my understanding is that the mutations come in at the rate of about 70. So you look at these millions of base pairs, there's about 70 accumulated per generation. So that's those changes in those letters of the code. And the interesting thing is that some of those changes don't make any difference to the amino acids or the proteins that are produced. They're kind of like two words that you can spell in two different ways, American English or Australian English. And it won't change the meaning of the word. And those particular changes, some of those changes in those letters, T, C, G, A, won't change at all. And the really interesting thing from the human genome and the evolution point of view is that as things are further separated in their family tree, you can accumulate differences there because it doesn't change what protein's been made. It's sort of like neutral background stuff. And yet there's really interesting patterns. If you look at closely related animals, the further they've been separated, either by being isolated on an island or something like that, the greater number of these differences in these letters that you find. Even though if you can, because we know what all the letters code for, We know how many of the differences that are different. If you've sequenced the human genome, we know how many of those actual sequences affect the protein or not. And so you can compare between individual organisms and see, well, how many different proteins are being made, but also how many differences are there which don't contribute to a difference in protein. And those differences accumulate over time as to how long things have been isolated just through natural processes. And I guess that's the sort of thing that Trevor and I think Brian mentioned it as well, genetic entropy. That's part of the genetic entropy that happens. But the really interesting thing are the patterns that fit with the evolutionary model, which are harder to explain from any other way than the evolutionary model, I think.
All right, and I've got a question, a personal question of Joshua. Joshua, you're a mechatronic engineer, but you have actually got a passion for interest in biology and genetics and whatever. When did you get what did you do to gain all your information? Did you read books on biochemistry or what?
Well, I read up a lot about it, even just during my high school. I took all the extra classes. I was very fascinated with it. And after high school, I continued to read on the topic. Yeah, I've got some. Actually, I've got a textbook on genetics, which I have only just recently acquired. But in general, I just sort of read what I can, find what I can when I can find it. Yeah. I didn't touch the subject for a number of years before this, though. So a lot of it I had forgotten. So I did have to brush up.
So is this under the category of biochemistry?
I don't know.
What's the difference? What's the difference between biochemistry and genetics?
This is more just genetics, really. I mean, I wouldn't have thought of biochemistry. I hated chemistry, so if it was said biochemistry, I probably wouldn't have touched it.
Molecular biology was another.
Yeah, molecular biology is interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I suppose I found it fascinating. I guess cellular activity and how it works. I always found it quite fascinating.
I think the biggest question is, Josh, is do your children look more like their mother or more like their father?
Their mother. Like they're all 3 girls. They don't really look like me at all. Their mum. Yeah, they scream a lot. Yeah. And they're not as laid back as no, they're not that good. They're actually really well behaved girls. Probably a bit hard to tell. They're 6, 4, and almost 2. So.
A lot of growing.
So how many were born in Australia? That could be a telling point.
2 of them.
Yeah. So
2 of them are trouble.
Yeah.
One of them sees reason.
Well, I reckon by the time they're 7, all their patterns are set.
Well, I hope not. That means I've got one year left to rein in on the oldest one.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I think we'll wind it up now, unless anybody's got any pressing issues that I'd like to raise at this point.
Very much, Josh.
Yeah.
Thanks, Josh.
No, thanks for putting up with the presentation. It was a little bit disjointed, but hopefully it was reasonable to follow the line of thought anyway.
All right. At this stage, I'll
Stop
stop the recording, and then you can say what you like afterwards.